Hello and welcome to another Faces interview. My name is Samantha Quadros and I am a correspondent for Refuge. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Donald Kingsbury. He's a lecturer and researcher in Latin American studies and political science at the University of Toronto. His work includes the topics of extractivism, political ecology, and decarbonization in the Americas. Well, hi, Dr. Kingsbury. Thank you for joining us today. To start off, could you tell
Thanks
us
for having me.
could you tell us a bit about yourself, your role as a professor and as a researcher, and what are your areas of focus?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I teach in the departments of political science and Latin American studies here at the University of Toronto. My work, sorry, I have a 5-year-old upstairs who's participating in the interview in his own way.
No worries. Like the pandemic.
It is the pandemic. Anyway, so we got real right away. So anyway, where was I? I'm a assistant professor teaching stream at the University of Toronto. I work in Latin American studies and political science. My work focuses on energy transitions and extractivism. Extractivism being an approach to studying Latin American political ecology that thinks of resource extraction not just as the physical process of pulling material out of the ground, but the entire sociocultural and political structures that facilitate that extraction of resources, the kind of power differentials between people at the sites of mines, people who work in mines, people who own mining companies, and people who consume the products that eventually come out of the process of mining, be it gold, be it copper, be it lithium.
So Dr. Kingsbury, you've been to Ecuador for field research. You're very involved in Latin America. What inspired you to study this region?
Well, I was inspired to study Latin America as a region. I've been doing solidarity work and activist work since I was in high school, initially around the Zapatista rebellion in southern Mexico. And this was a moment where I grew up in the Rust Belt of the United States, and I was seeing how my communities were being affected by economic restructuring and by, at the time, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that many of us in the United States were being asked to blame Mexico for losing industrial jobs, losing jobs because of how companies were moving production abroad in order to increase their profits. And then here was this rebel army in Chiapas, Mexico, the Zapatistas, who were saying, NAFTA is impacting us just like it's impacting you. And we're identifying an entire world of both, power imbalances, ideologies that really justify the kind of just everyday slow violence that impacts everybody, but in different ways. So that was me in high school. I really became enthralled with the Zapatistas and was doing a lot of work around Zapatista solidarity. And this eventually led to a lifetime of different academic and activist pursuits, either in Cuba or Guatemala. And eventually I ended up with a job in the Venezuelan Ministry of Planning and Development in the early 2000s.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's been a wild trip. Saying it out loud, it's been a wild trip. But living in Venezuela, where I was working with social movements, I came to really realize just how deep the extraction of resources, in Venezuela's case, oil, really kind of underwrites a lot of not just political economy, but even like social identity in places like Venezuela in the case of oil. And so I worked in Venezuela for quite a long time. I've become, I think, as everybody in the kind of millennial cohort, I guess I'm a geriatric millennial, you're what comes after millennials, but our entire lives have been framed by climate change. It's been real and palpable for my entire life. And increasingly, My work on oil in Venezuela and in Ecuador led me to ask questions about decarbonization and what decarbonization will mean for different people in different places. Cutting oil out of the economy might look like an electrified power grid and a Tesla here in Ontario. It means something very different in a country that's dependent on oil exports for its national revenue stream, like Venezuela, or countries like Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, where lithium is being extracted that will form the batteries that make those power grids work or those Teslas run. And so it's a very different places have different experiences of energy transitions, of decarbonization. And so that's kind of the long road to how I got to this question. So it had to do with an interest in hemispheric solidarity, to asking questions of what do energy transitions mean for different people in different places.
So I've talked about your interest in Latin America, your experience. You mentioned Cuba and Venezuela. In your paper, Combined and Uneven Transitions, Reactive Decarbonization in Cuba and Venezuela, you mentioned that, quote, risk, safety, lack, and excess have all been distributed rather unevenly throughout the history of carbon capitalism, largely following patterns in place since the colonial era, end quote. Could you please describe to our viewers what is carbon capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely. Carbon capitalism just refers to the particular, the details, the modes of operation of the global economy as it exists now. Nobody would say that it's not a capitalist economy. That's just it. It is a capitalist global economy, has been for quite some time. Adding carbon to capitalism identifies that it's a form of organizing politics and society that is very dependent on a sort of energy dense matrix, right? That's based on fossil fuels. That the kinds of, if you take a North American example, the kinds of like social organizations based on, the nuclear family, single family household, houses with yards, etc. So if you look at the way streets are designed in like a city like Toronto, where we sacrifice so much shared public space to automobiles, where we have to check with business owners who are worried about parking space before we can, create more access to parks and patios and things of that nature. So what carbon capitalism really identifies is the way in which the global economy runs not just on oil as this large section of the economy, but also the ways in which the norms of the global economy are also informed by and structured by oil, by energy intense modes of life.
So you've talked about carbon capitalism, how it is very pervasive in our society and reflected in our everyday life, and how countries experience its effects differently. Well, why is it that countries with comparatively minor contributions to climate change are the ones most vulnerable to its effects?
And it has to do with inequality, just plain and simple. It's that, rich countries that produce the largest carbon footprint are also making the decisions in terms of who will be protected and who will be sacrificed when the oceans rise. They're the countries, rich countries have more infrastructure, have stronger public institutions that will be able to relocate people, that will be able to inject massive amounts of funding into a Green New Deal, quote unquote. Whereas a country like Bolivia doesn't have that much, doesn't have the same scale of resources to redesign its economy, nor does it have the same amount of pull in transnational institutions. Poor countries, by definition, weren't invited to the big G7 conference that just took place other than as spectators. Right? So it's all about inequality. The countries that weren't allowed to industrialize in the same way that the North Atlantic industrialized in the 20th century are the same countries that are going to be left out to dry, left vulnerable as the effects of the climate crisis continue to deepen.
So still on the topic of carbon capitalism, climate change, and its effects, decarbonization of the global economy stems from the idea that climate change has increased demands and necessity for transitions to renewable energy. Lithium is seen as a crucial resource due to its ability to store large amounts of energy. And we know that the search for lithium has been powered by destructive extraction practices. Based on your studies, your experiences with the locals, what are the social and environmental impacts of these practices in Latin America?
Sure. I mean, if you want to talk specifically about lithium, the thing about these kind of extractive processes is they're all very highly localized, and so the impact of gold mining in Peru will be different in those communities surrounding that gold mine than an oil well in Venezuela, or a lithium brine operation in the so-called lithium triangle in northern Chile, western Argentina, and southern Bolivia. The big thing that is really impacting that local communities are concerned about when it comes to lithium mining, the process of lithium mining in the southern cone, right, in the Andes, is done by extracting brine from subterranean aquifers. And this brine is very rich in lithium and other minerals. And then through a long, sometimes 12 to 14 month long process, this brine is pumped to the surface, and the lithium is separated from the water, from potassium, from all sorts of other minerals that are located in the brine. And then in some cases, the water is pumped back into the ground, and in some cases it's not. Now, the problem specifically for lithium here is the lithium brine deposits are located in high altitude desert ecosystems that are incredibly arid, and where the modes of life that local peoples have developed in these complex desert and very fragile ecosystems depends on a certain sort of balance between human activity and the water table and the watersheds and animal life, right? And so people are very concerned about water, about what lithium will do to the kind of balance their livelihoods have eked out with the landscape in terms of the give and take of water. Water is also increasingly scarce because of the climate crisis and because of the process of the kind of receding glaciers or deglaciation that's taking place throughout the Andes. So it compounds crises. So droughts are getting longer, water supplies aren't being refilled by seasonal runoff, and you've got mining companies pumping water out from subterranean aquifers, further damaging access to the most important, one of the three most important parts of life, water. So that's the big thing, really, is how the increased impacts on water is going to impact people's livelihoods. There's other concerns around jobs. There's other concerns that always come with mining. The influx of more populations, the prevalence of so-called man camps, how this impacts the local population. But I think if there's one central thing, it's water.
So water, also how extraction affects the access to other resources. How does this relate to the forced displacement of Latin American people, indigenous people specifically?
Yeah, so there's two kinds of forced displacement. One is very obvious. It's when private security guards or official police agents come in and kick you out of your home and say there's going to be a mine there. There's also the displacement that comes from diminished livelihoods or prospects, where because there's a lack of water and you can't grow your crops or tend to your animals, because the impacts on water has damaged other sectors of the economy. You can't get a job and help take care of your family. So it's really multifaceted. But you get both the direct enforcement of property rights at mining concessions that takes place through both state and private security forces. But then the more subtle, what a colleague of mine describes in terms of slow violence, where people just realize that they can't practice their livelihood in a place where they have previously, sometimes for generations.
Yeah, I was
And by
reading.
definition, I was just going to add, I mean, these tend to impact indigenous peoples more because, I mean, for instance, lithium is not actually a terribly rare mineral. It's not that it can only be discovered in these certain places. It's that these particular places in the Andes are kind of far-flung, um, remote locations that are deemed sacrificable, that are deemed expendable. I've conducted interviews with people in the mining industry, and they'll often say, "Well, nobody lives there," um, by which they mean, even if they don't say it explicitly, not enough people or not enough of a certain kind of people live there for us to care.
Mm.
So so this is a concern. Um, as we've seen, so for example, the European Union is very keen to get its electric vehicle and lithium ion battery operations up and running at scale to reach their climate goals, their decarbonization goals. However, when companies and EU regulators have tried to put lithium mines in northern Portugal, for example, they've faced intense resistance by locals and local regulators. People are hesitant to have a mine in their backyard. So they find places where they don't have to experience it, where they can only get the end product and not have to deal with the origin story of lithium, which is, impacts on the water table, displacement of peoples, disruptions of livelihoods and landscapes.
And based on what you said, what can be done government-wise, internationally, locally, to protect these people that are being affected by the lithium extraction? For example, what can be done to prevent and reduce the risk of this forced displacement?
I mean, first and foremost is listen to them. that's the number one. It should not be ridiculous to say that local peoples should have a direct and directing say in how their lives are and livelihoods are impacted by mining. Whether and what that might also mean is that rather than thinking of decarbonization as just maintaining our lifestyles in the north, but just swapping out Teslas for internal combustion motor vehicles, that's not the way to go. That it's going to require changes. And I'm not talking about like you personally should bike more. You should, but it's not about your individual decisions. It's about restructuring the economy such that this model of endless growth for the sake of growth is not the way we determine the healthiness or sickliness of an economy. So we need to push past the kind of paradigm of growth that defines carbon capitalism and push towards something that has other values front and center, like harmony, sustainability, like the ability for us to continue to exist in 50 years. Nobody thinks we can do that by following the same path we've been on since the Industrial Revolution. So there has to be a sort of reappraisal of the structuring conditions that define the economy. And you need to first and foremost listen to the people who are directly being impacted by extraction. First and foremost, but also the North needs to drastically adjust both how it lives its life in the North, how we live our lives in the North, and the kind of demands and expectations that are put upon people in places like Latin America. But here we could also talk about, not just Latin America, we could talk about parts of, most of Africa, but we could also talk about Appalachia. We can talk about Northern Ontario, right? There's parts of the global South in the global North as well.
So you brought something that was very interesting. It's how people are worried of where we will be in 50 years, Earth, quality of life. And there was the G7 this weekend, and one of the main topics was climate change and what can be done to mitigate its effects. So this is a very broad question, but what are your thoughts more generally on how the world is handling climate change?
It's not. It's where the problem is that so much control has been surrendered to markets And for so long, the response to climate change, the priority has been how can we make sure that, you know, it's still that the response to climate change still generates a profit, essentially. And you see that in most of the initiatives. The other thing you see, is this sort of we're almost at a point where we're at like a separating point where we can either have a global Green New Deal where there is a concerted cooperative effort across across the globe to address climate change, to mitigate climate change, and to rebuild a more equitable and sustainable world. Or, and this is the path it looks like we're going down, a sort of green Cold War, where it's the impetus for the United States plans under the kind of Biden framing is we need to electrify our grid and get our lithium production domestically ramped up, because if we don't, China will do it. Right, and it's this kind of like Sinophobia. If we don't do it, China's going to rule the world, sort of thing. And that is only going to be the case if we make it so. That rather than this green Cold War, we need a Green New Deal of cooperation and good faith collaboration, which again we haven't really seen. What we've seen is up to this point, we've seen the North Atlantic really doing everything in its power, desperate to try to maintain the influence it's had, control it's had over the globe for the past 500 years. And the problem is not much of the globe, nobody has benefited. Nobody's benefited from Northern hegemony for the past 500 years, not even most of us in the North. So that's, so you asked a very big question, I gave a very big answer.
No, it was a really good answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Kingsbury, for sharing your knowledge with us. And this was a very interesting conversation. And I feel like our viewers have learned a lot about how extractivism and decarbonization are affecting people in Latin America. So thank you for joining us today.